Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome everybody to the first of 2 days of what I think will be some invigorating conversations meant to examine the legacy of President Lyndon B. Johnson in El Paso. We've got a great series of speakers over the next few days, and I'm very much looking forward to it. My name is Bob Moore. I'm the editor of the El Paso Times, and I worked with Adair Margo and the Tom Lee Institute in organizing this 2 days of a much broader month filled with learning opportunities tied to Tom Lee's life in El Paso. The 20th century was very much the Tom Lee century in El Paso, and it's kind of hard to imagine much that happened in Texas during the 20th century that did not touch the life of Tom Lee. And as Adair could tell you, his relationship with President Johnson is certainly one of those, and that's why we're having this LBJ conference tied in with Tom Lee Month. So we have a couple of speakers tonight who will help us kick things off, and I'll introduce them. The first, before I do that, I do want to thank the El Paso Community Foundation for giving us use of this room this evening on very short notice for reasons I think most of you are familiar with. And then also for helping us with the reception tonight. The snacks and the beverages tonight were provided by the El Paso Community Foundation. We very much appreciate their support. Our first speaker tonight is Gus Sanchez. Gus came to El Paso this spring to become the superintendent of the Chamizal National Memorial. Last year, as Adair and I first began to talk about this LBJ conference, we were trying to decide where to have it, and immediately we hit on the idea of the Chamizal National Memorial, because that's probably the most visible symbol of President Johnson's contributions to El Paso. So imagine how thrilled we were when we found out this spring that the new superintendent of the Chamizal was coming to us from the Lyndon B. Johnson National Park in the Hill Country, and we're just thinking, wow, this is fate. How great can this be? We have this expert on LBJ right here in our backyard. We're going to use his wonderful facility. He's put together this wonderful photo exhibit using his connections with the LBJ National Park. We're going to be able to show people lots of great images, get everybody really excited. And then we found out that the Congress of the United States has the power to screw up fate. The Chamizal, like all other national parks in the United States, has been forced to close for the last couple of weeks. So the really disappointing thing for me is that you're not able tonight to see this really wonderful exhibit that Gus put together. But I would encourage everybody, once the government reopens, which we're hoping will probably be next week, the way things are going, although never put it beyond the power of our government to screw things up even worse. But hopefully you'll have an opportunity to go out there, and the exhibit will be up. Please stop by to visit that. So we still wanted to have Gus speak a little bit because he is such an expert on President Johnson. And as a disclaimer, you need to know that Gus is here tonight as a private citizen, not as a government employee, because it would be illegal for him to work under the current conditions. So with that, we'd like to ask Gus to come up and say a few words.
Thank you very much. I wanted to just start off by mentioning to everyone how happy me and my wife Julie have been to move here to El Paso, and how welcome we've been by the community. And it's really great to be here. I wanted to just say a few brief words about LBJ's connection to the Chamizal. The subject of Lyndon Baines Johnson, the 36th president, is so big that you run into the same problem that every interpretive park ranger in the national parks has. You start off and you say, how am I going to speak for just 10 minutes when the problem is, how do I keep it down to 10 minutes? There's so much to talk about because Lyndon Johnson, in all of his years of service as a secretary to a congressman, as a congressman, as a senator, as a Senate Majority Leader, as the Vice President of the United States, and finally as the 36th President of the United States, was involved in so much for the country, but especially through most of my career, so much for Texas, that you know, it's almost overwhelming. And so that's one of the reasons why there's more books published about Lyndon Baines Johnson than any other president in history. A lot of people, some people loved him, a lot of people hated him. And then there's everything in between. But either way, you are fascinated by this particular national leader of the United States of America. And I found that to be true. So I just wanted to mention that, and some of those connections with El Paso will come up during our conference today and tomorrow. And you'll learn a lot more about LBJ and his connection to El Paso. But specifically, I want to talk about the Chamizal. Most people don't know that in 1954, Senator Lyndon Johnson admonished President Eisenhower about his failure to do something about the Chamizal situation. So long before there was any talk of the, or any thought of the Chamizal Treaty being settled by the efforts of President Kennedy, Senator Lyndon Johnson, as the senator from Texas, had this in his mind. There's other links to the Chamizal story. In 1959, Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson hosts an official state visit by President Lopez Mateos of Mexico to the LBJ Ranch. And the exhibit on display at the closed national park has an exhibit panel about that visit. So you can see Johnson forging very powerful ties with players in this story long before it becomes reality. And then later on, of course, there's also photos of President Diaz-Ordaz also, or President-elect Diaz-Ordaz visiting the LBJ Ranch for an LBJ-style barbecue. And you know that the Chamizal comes up in these conversations. So LBJ had a long-term vested interest in the Chamizal issue. And just yesterday I was speaking to a local resident of El Paso who was telling me, you know, LBJ was also really instrumental as a senator in the establishment of some of the bridges here in El Paso. So he had this long connection to El Paso and to the Chamizal story. It shouldn't be, of course, after President Kennedy's tragic death, Johnson becomes the president, and so he's the one that ends up signing the Treaty of Chamizal when the president signs it. And he's the one that continues the establishment of the Chamizal area. So all of that history is available to us, and it's, as I was sharing with Adair's mom earlier, the thing about history is that if you really study more and we take advantage of these kinds of opportunities, that's when you realize that the more in depth you go with history, the more fascinating it becomes. Believe me, folks, you couldn't make up stories that are this fascinating. And so that's what this story is about. That's what these links, these historical links, and you know, whether you believe in fate or not, since we started off talking about that. The fact is that for some reason, things happen in a certain way, and sometimes that energy brings people together, and we can continue to expand our knowledge of our community, our world, and our country by looking a little bit further into history and trying to apply some of those lessons. So let's think about that, you know. I know that, in fact, tonight I'm wearing my LBJ pin that Lady Bird Johnson gave me. One of the actual pins that the president used to hand out. Not a reproduction. And I wear it proudly as a gift from one of the most gracious women that I've ever met in my entire life. I was honored to know her. I was honored to serve as the Chief of Operations at Ern German at the LBJ Ranch right next to the President. It'll always be one of the greatest days, memories of my career. And so, thank you, folks, for your support. Although I'm not on duty, thank you for supporting the national parks and Chamizal. And I wanted to just mention, don't forget to learn a little bit more about it because the rewards are vast. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Gus, and thank you for the excellent transition to our next speaker here, too. We're very privileged tonight to have a distinguished Texan here with us to talk about Lady Bird Johnson. You cannot tell the story of Lyndon Johnson, obviously, without a deep exploration of a woman who had such a tremendous influence throughout his adult life. And who survived him by a number of years and continued to play a major role in the civic life of the United States until her death. So we're very privileged today to have Michael Gillette join us. Michael has been the Executive Director of Humanities Texas since 2003. His former positions include directing the LBJ Library's Oral History Program from 1976 to 1991 and serving as Director for the Center for Legislative Archives from 1991 to 2003, with responsibility for the official records of the United States Senate and House of Representatives in the National Archives. Gillette serves on the advisory board of the John Glenn School of Public Affairs at The Ohio State University and the board of directors of the Congressional Education Foundation. He's a member of the Philosophical Society of Texas and served as its president in 2009. His newest book, which is what he's here to discuss today, is called Lady Bird Johnson, An Oral History. It was released by Oxford University Press in 2012. Dr. Gillette received his BA in government and his PhD in history from the University of Texas at Austin. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Gillette.
Thank you, Bob, for that generous introduction. It's a great pleasure to be back in El Paso. Sam Moore met me at the airport. Sam Moore, the great friend of Humanities Texas and our former chair, who brought me to El Paso, I think, in 2003 for the Philosophical Society. Is that right, Sam? Is that what it was? I think it was, and introduced me to that organization. And Maceo Daly, another former chair of our board, Humanities Texas, who led the search committee that hired me. So I have great respect for Maceo's judgment. And Adair Margot, who, what can you say about Adair? Gosh, I used to say if I had 3 Adair Margos, I could rule the world. But Adair introduced me to 2 of the greatest treasures we have in this state, the city of El Paso and the art of Tom Lee. And fresh from seeing the wonderful Tom Lee exhibit in the state capitol yesterday, I appreciate his work even more every time I see it. It just grows on you, and you see things you didn't see before, and it's just endlessly beautiful and fascinating. The LBJ loved Mexico. Mrs. Johnson had a terrible time driving him to embassy parties, unless it was a party at the Mexican embassy. In her oral history, she talked about how he felt, how he believed believes so strongly in the importance of Mexico as an ally, as a neighbor of the United States, and how much he valued its friendship. And I think his interest in the Chamizal was a product of his great appreciation of Mexico. The wonderful day in Juarez in October 1967, when he and President Diaz-Ordaz got together, and they were great friends. Their families were friends, their children were friends, their wives were friends. So it was more than just a diplomatic thing. When the two families got together, it was really a personal friendship. Another thing I want to mention about Mexico is that although the vast majority of my oral history, my 37 oral history interviews with Lady Bird Johnson were done in the Yellow Sitting Room of the LBJ Ranch, a few of them were actually done in Mexico. The reason for that was that every January, Mrs. Johnson would spend a couple of weeks in Acapulco, renting a villa in Las Brisas, and but she was so disciplined that she always liked to do some work every day, even when she was on vacation, and I was the work. So I thought that was pretty great. You can see how long ago these interviews were done just by looking at the gentleman on the far right. It was true.
That's you?
It was smooth. And she was approximately the age I am now when we did these interviews years and years ago. I hadn't heard her voice, her young voice, and I hadn't listened to these tapes or read these transcripts in sometimes 30 years. So when the library opened these interviews up in 2011, it was really a wonderful experience for me to go back and relive that time with her. We spent a great deal of time. I should mention that the last gig that I did was for the Kansas City Public Library and Truman Institute. They have a series there on First Ladies, and the series is titled Beyond the Gowns, American First Ladies. And I had to explain to the audience that, at least in the case of Lady Bird Johnson, it's not easy to get beyond the gowns because the clothes won't stay in the closet. And the reason for that is when you have 2 daughters and 6 granddaughters, they end up wearing all of your White House gowns. So they're her granddaughters, and as a tribute to their grandmother, whom they loved, they would, at appropriate occasions, wear her dresses. So it's not easy to get beyond the gowns, which have a life of their own. These oral histories that I did with Mrs. Johnson began in 1977, and they formed the narrative of my book, Lady Bird Johnson, An Oral History. The book is really her story in her own words. And the book is really comprised of 3 tracks that run concurrently. The first track consists of her perceptions, her views as a witness participant in history across 4 decades in Texas and Washington, when she describes in intricate detail some of the events and personalities that really shaped our modern world. The second track charts the phenomenal political rise of LBJ through a combination of extraordinary good fortune, consummate political skill and resourcefulness, and incredibly hard work. And the third and most compelling track is the transformation of a shy Southern girl into one of the most admired and effective first ladies in our history. And to me, that is the most interesting of the elements in this book, and that's what I want to visit with you a little bit about tonight. This transformation for me first came into focus one day when I was sitting in my oral history office in the spring of 1978. I received a call from Mrs. Johnson, and I remember her opening words were, "Hello, Mike, how would you like to do something zany?" And I thought, what could the former First Lady possibly mean by zany? And she quickly explained she invited me to accompany her to her 50th high school reunion at Marshall High in East Texas. She knew I was interviewing some people from her early life, and she thought this would be helpful. I went, Liz Carpenter came along, and it was a remarkable adventure in time travel, and one that brought a lot of context to the interviews that we were doing, because I had really never seen the area of East Texas where she grew up. And to just watch her at the reunion with her classmates, which brought out all of her warmth and youthful spirit, that was eye-opening to me. But it was clear that she was no longer the shy young country girl who dreaded the prospect of having to give a graduation speech, and was vastly relieved when two of the classmates outranked her, so she was spared that misery. Here she gave a wonderfully eloquent, humorous, nostalgia-filled talk about their times together, and she of course was completely comfortable in that role. So we see the before and after in terms of her transformation. But that trip also included some visits to several of the landmarks of her youth. We walked around the brick house, the antebellum plantation home where she'd been born, and we also visited the little country cemetery where her mother was buried when she was only 5 years old. And finally, we climbed into john boats and ventured out into Caddo Lake with those wonderfully majestic cypress trees that were laden with Spanish moss. And it was so easy for me to realize how her love of nature evolved from growing up in that setting, that spectacular setting. You couldn't ignore nature when it was so picturesque. But the setting also imposed a great deal of isolation on her, because she didn't have a mother and she didn't have many playmates. It was a very sparsely populated area. And that isolation caused her to be very self-reliant. And she was all her life. Not only self-reliant, but also she developed a love of reading, because she didn't have a lot else to do. She became a voracious reader. So in the context of that rural, isolated area, she developed a love of nature, and she attributes it to that. And she developed a love of reading, and she developed a self-reliance. Okay, now let's fast forward to 1934. She has just graduated from the University of Texas with her second degree, this one in journalism. Her first one was in history. She also earned a secondary teaching certificate, and she had taken courses in shorthand and typing so she could get a job as a secretary if necessary. So she's prepared to be a reporter, or a school teacher, or a secretary. But what does she do after graduation? In the midst of the Great Depression, she takes a graduation trip to New York and Washington, and then she moves back to Karnak to spend a year sitting around Karnak with her father and remodeling the brick house. That's her plan. I asked her in the interviews what she wanted to do for a career. What were her career objectives at that point? And she said she really didn't have any. That she was going to see where fate led me, as if she were a spectator of her own life. What was missing here was ambition, the sort of ambition that gives drive and direction and purpose to life. And even though she lacked all of that, it's going to change dramatically in one day. September the 5th, 1934, she drives to Austin to meet with an architect. And while she's there, she goes into the state capitol office of a friend from East Texas. And while she's visiting with that friend, a young man named Lyndon Johnson comes in, and he asks her to have breakfast with him the next morning. And while they're having breakfast, he asks her to ride around in the hill country. And they ride around all day, and while they're riding around, he asks her to marry him. Now, I'm going to let her tell the story of this courtship, but I want you to know that the conversation about this part of her life, this courtship, is 2 hours long. I'm not going to keep you, I'm going to give you about a 5-minute segment, but you'll be able to hear how she reacts to this first encounter with LBJ.
So I know there was something electric going, and then he did ask me to have breakfast with him the next morning. And that I was sort of unsure whether I wanted to or not, and didn't call to make it firm. And I started by to see Hugo Cuny, whose office was next door to the Driscoll. And there was Lyndon sitting in the dining room on the other side of this big plate glass window, where I was just walking past, and he looked up and flagged me down, and he was there waiting for me, and I don't know whether psychologically I intended to, all the time I meant to go or not. In any case, it was a near miss. After breakfast, and somehow after the architect and he had his way, we did get in his car and ride and ride and ride, and he did a great deal of talking.
Well, how was he different from the other young men that you knew at this point? Was there anything distinctive about him that struck you right off?
Well, he came on strong, and he was very, very direct and dynamic, and you just had a sense of this is. I didn't know quite what to make of him.
Did you sense that magnitude?
I did, quite clearly. And I do believe before the day was over, he did ask me to marry him, and I thought he was just out of his mind. It was very, I'm a slow, considered sort of person generally, and certainly not given to quick conclusions, much rash behavior. And
do you remember where you were when you proposed? Were you still riding around at the time?
we were, and we rode around all day long, and then part of it we did drive around to some of my favorite haunts, which were the lovely little country roads around Austin, where there were these clear streams running over the white rocks and chalky limestone, and it was exciting. It was intensely exciting, also a little bit frightening, because I was often sure I wanted to know him any better.
Do you remember where you were when he proposed?
No, I don't.
It was on the first day though?
I do believe it was. It sounds absolutely too outrageous, but he has said so many times himself, and I think he was correct.
Read that when he proposed, you didn't say yes and you didn't say no.
No, I didn't. I just sat there with my mouth open, kind of.
So after a 2.5-month courtship and a madcap drive across Texas, she succumbed to the Johnson treatment, and they got married and took their honeymoon in Mexico. apparently the honeymoon was one of the bargaining chips that LBJ used. He knew that she really wanted to see Mexico, and so he had that as part of the mix. Now, if opposites attract, then there surely was, as she phrased it, something electric going on when they met, because it's hard to imagine two people more nearly opposite than LBJ and Claudia Taylor. You know, she was conservative, cautious, and judicious, while he was impulsive, liberal, and always in a hurry. While she had a calm, gracious, shy demeanor, he was expansive, demanding, and volatile. Where she was thrifty, he was given to acts of extravagant generosity. And if she was essentially a private, self-reliant person, he desperately needed to have people around him. So we might ask, well, what did she see in Lyndon Johnson? The people that I interviewed who had known him in the 1930s emphasized how dynamic and attractive he was and how exciting it was to be around him. Just the power that he exuded even as a young man. And that exciting was the word that she used to summarize that day together. But I think there was another factor, and that was just his drive, his forcefulness, his raw ambition. She wrote to him during the courtship, she said, "I adore you for being so ambitious." She shared that. And he imparted to her that sense of purpose, that ambition. And the second excerpt I'm going to play for you is her description of that purpose in life. And she's talking about less than a year after they got married, they moved back to Texas. LBJ was appointed the Texas director of the National Youth Administration, a New Deal agency for keeping young people in school and getting them jobs. And this was a statewide responsibility that had him traveling all over the state, day and night, working weekends. And I asked her if this meant that they didn't get to spend enough time together, the two of them. And here's her answer.
Well, did you feel that you didn't have enough time together during this? Was she talking
We certainly didn't have much time together. But then, fortunately, I was always independent, badly, and I did not feel deprived or mad at the job or mad at him. And I always felt that each job we were in was a significant job. And Mayor Tom used to have a saying, something like each of us is in search of the significant. And it was satisfying, it was significant, and I wanted it to succeed. I liked being a part of it, although I must say I had a mighty small role.
Well,
If I had to do over again, I think I would have learned more about it and try to be more part of it.
She described LBJ as a regular Henry Higgins, explaining that he stretched her, as he did everyone around him, challenging her to do more than she thought she could do. And this had a lot to do with that transformation. I'm going to cite 3 or 4 examples. The first one, when he went on active duty in the Navy in 1942, he enlisted her to run the congressional office, and this was very unusual for the time. And she answered the mail, she worked with constituents that came up from the 10th District, she met with officials in the executive branch agencies and departments, she studied the legislation, she kept up with the politics in the district, she met with the other congressmen from the district. She did everything that a congressman could do except vote. She couldn't vote. But she did that for the whole time that he was away. And this was important in two respects. Number one, it gave her an extraordinary understanding of what his life was like. And she also learned a lot more about the congressional district and their needs and projects and the personalities there. But in addition to that, it gave her a lot of self-confidence. She had never done anything. She'd never had a job. And here, for this time, she ran a congressional office, and he made sure that she was actually in charge. This experience enabled her to do something even more important the following year. When they bought the radio station, she moved back to Austin in 1943 to reorganize and manage that station. She spent the spring down there doing that, and it was the experience that she had the year before that gave her the confidence to do that. And of course, the radio station became the foundation of their financial empire. So that was very important. If you look at her role in his political campaigns, she was excluded from his first campaign in 1937 because the campaign manager didn't believe that women should be involved in political campaigns. So all she did was the laundry. But in every successive campaign, she played an increasingly larger role and overcame her horror about speaking in public. So that by the time of the 1948 campaign, the 87 vote election against Coach Stevenson, if you read the chapter in my book, I think you'll conclude, as I did, that he wouldn't have even remained in the race, let alone won, if it hadn't been for her involvement. When he was in the hospital with kidney stones and he'd given up the campaign, was going to drop out, she kept him away from the press, got him to the Mayo Clinic for this quick operation, got him back in the campaign, kept him viable as a candidate in the meantime. And then at the end of the campaign, she traveled all over the state mobilizing groups of women to support him. Well, in an 87 vote election, that counts for a lot of votes. The last example I want to cite is took place in the early 50s when he decided he wanted to sort of enhance his Western persona. He needed a ranch. And without consulting with Mrs. Johnson, he went out and bought the dilapidated, if you'll excuse me, it was dilapidated. She was advised by friends to just bulldoze it and start over, use the site. But she moved back to Austin again and spent the spring remodeling the ranch, hiring a foreman, doing all of the things that she needed to do to make that place habitable. And keep in mind that by this time she had a house in Austin, a house in Washington, and 2 daughters in LBJ's political campaign. So there was a lot of multitasking involved in that project. But the more he relied on her, the more he could depend on her. And the more adept she became, and the more influential she became in his world. So it got to the point that her influence on him was as great or greater than his influence on her. I have one last excerpt I want you to hear that gives an example of her influence on him. When she desperately wants to buy a home, this is earlier, this is in 1942, when she really is nesting anymore. But they've been moving around 13, 14 times, and she's tired of that. She wants a real home.
I floated the real estate portion of the newspaper. And Sunday afternoon was the time to ride around and look at the possibilities. Lyndon and John Connery and I were riding around to see one that had been advertised out in right off of Connecticut Avenue in El Paso Hills. It was called at 4921 30th request. I wanted, partly as a result of having waited so long, and because by the time I finished doing what I wanted to, it would acquire charm, and it had so many basics. I walked out of the house thinking that we had really agreed to buy it. As we drove down the street, I said, Linda, when are you going to give him a check? And Linda said, well, we're not going to buy it. And I burst into tears, which were very angry tears, something I practically never did. And I said, all I've got to look forward to is one more damn campaign. And I really let him know what I thought of the 14 or so moves we had made. And the, let me see, how many years of marriage would that be by that time? From 30 to about 8, close to 8. So he looked shocked. And John looked at him and got a grin and said, I think you better go back and buy that house.
So they did go back and buy the house, and there are a lot of wonderful stories connected with the purchase of the house and the old ladies' furniture that you surely know about that LBJ went out and bought to furnish the house with. But that house was so important to LBJ's political fortunes because finally they had a place to entertain, and there were some bachelors like Sam Rayburn and Dick Russell who loved to come over to the Johnson home and experience Lady Bird's hospitality and Zephyr Wright's wonderful comfort food, fabulous meals. And of course LBJ would call about an hour beforehand and say, I'm bringing 12 people home for dinner. And so Mrs. Johnson and Zephyr Wright would scramble around, and they kept enough in the freezer to accommodate these sort of impulsive needs that the LBJ seemed to have. But it was an important asset in her, again, being part of his political world. So rather than going off somewhere else, he just brought people home. So Mrs. Johnson was privy to some wonderful political conversations and deals. There was another factor in her transformation that she described as the society he thrust me into. And this included a combination of things. First of all, the Texas establishment in Washington, the wonderful Texas delegation, and you had, of course, Ewing Thomason and his wife from El Paso. There were many wonderful couples that became very close friends and really bonded. The Texans were a close-knit group in those days. There were all of the clubs that the wives of members of Congress belonged to. If your husband was elected to serve in the 75th Congress, you were a member of the 75th Club. If your husband was elected to serve in the Senate in the 81st Club, you were, or 81st Congress, you were a member of the 81st Club. There was a congressional club that involved every congressional spouse and Senate spouse. There was a Senate Ladies Club that just involved the wife of the senators, and she was a member of all of these. There were many, many very intelligent, accomplished, experienced women in each of these organizations, and Mrs. Johnson just loved it. She learned and just, as she put it, just soaked up all of the stories and experiences and travels and what people were reading. And if you think about it, at the time, so many of these very accomplished, very intelligent, even brilliant women were not in the workforce. They had their own circle, and Lady Bird Johnson benefited enormously from that. She also had all of the travels, the political travels all over the country, the foreign trips that she was able to take, And so this apprenticeship as a congressional wife, as a Senate wife, as a vice president's wife, because she was a stand-in for Jacqueline Kennedy, often made her perhaps the best prepared First Lady to enter the White House that we've ever had, because she had been in Washington, she had been involved for years. And she used to say that I found myself on stage for a role for which I had never rehearsed. Well, she may not have rehearsed, but she was certainly prepared for it. And the first thing that she did was assemble a very able professional staff in the East Wing of the White House, and this was something new. She also brought legions of very bright women and men to beautify and conserve the nation's environment. They focused initially on Washington, D.C. to develop a spectacular showcase of what was possible so that all the millions of tourists could see an example and then go back to their own communities and do the same thing there. And next, she traveled around the country to call attention to the nation's scenic beauty and the threats to the environment. She was never happy with the term beautification, but they couldn't think of a better one. To her, beautification was just one thread, though, in a whole tapestry that included clean air and clean water and green spaces and parks in the cities and highways without billboards, additions to the national parks, and even cultural heritage tourism to see America first. But this wonderful environmental leadership was only one facet of her legacy as First Lady. She continued Jacqueline Kennedy's acquisition of period furniture and important American art for the White House. In 1964, she boarded the Lady Bird Special and campaigned through the South for her husband, becoming the first First Lady to campaign independently. She hosted women doers luncheons in the White House to recognize the achievements of notable women. She embraced Project Head Start and gave it the prominence of a White House launch. And that affected the early success of that program. And she, of course, participated in scores of state dinners and foreign trips and served graciously in that official capacity. At the same time, she provided him with an island of peace, as she described it, during the very turbulent 1960s. And for the historians, all the while, she recorded a diary, a White House diary of 1,750,000 words. Now that's discipline, to record that diary at the end of the day. How do we summarize Lady Bird Johnson? Her friend Liz Carpenter observed once that Mrs. Johnson was wise to pick beautification as a cause because it's so visible. It's something we can see and enjoy and appreciate all around us. Mrs. Johnson's own evaluation of herself was always unfailingly modest. She said, all I did was make a lot of lists and check them off one by one. But she did concede that LBJ really relied on her judgment, and as she put it, we were better together than we were apart. My own take is that she was a smart, strong Southern woman of great warmth and sensitivity to the needs of others. And her self-discipline, her resilience, and her remarkable good judgment suited her for public life. But she never lost that youthful modesty and adventurous spirit and her extraordinary capacity for friendship. And it was my great good fortune to share that friendship. Thank you.